Hi, and welcome to the Wild Center's first ever live Barncast from the Adirondacks of New York State. I'm Tracy Leggett. The Wild Center first heard of two young, dynamic farmers on the shores of Lake Champlain almost 3 years ago when preparing for the Adirondack Youth Climate Summit. We wanted to show the 150 high school and college students attending that small-scale farming was a viable way of life and that it could be done by people not much older than they are, who were young and hip and cool. We didn't know what would happen when Kristin and Mark Kimball showed up to speak after dinner, but when the eggs, squash, and cauliflower began to fly around the Great Hall, we got a glimpse into their lives and farm. The students loved them. Last year, Kristin published the story of the growth of their farm, their love, and their life together in the dirty life. She has had a few readings at the Wild Center, and when we wanted to expand our audience by hosting a webcast, we couldn't think of a better topic to begin with. Tonight, she will read 2 segments of her book, and we'll speak with her afterwards. You have the opportunity to ask Kristin and Mark questions. Join the dialogue on our Facebook page and post your question there. Just search the Wild Center or on Twitter and use hashtag #TheDirtyLife. Before Kristin begins, I'm pleased to welcome her husband, farmer, and juggler extraordinaire, Mark, to talk with me a bit about Essex Farms, the 500-acre CSA farm that supports their members with a full diet, and how Mark got Kristin involved in the dirty life. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Tracy.
Well, it's great that we were able to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Now, can you just tell us a little bit about CSA Farms and what they are?
Yeah, I think some people call them CSA farms, some people call them memberships, and I think for people that aren't familiar with it, and I suspect many people are, it's almost like a subscription where you would sometimes pay a farmer in advance, sometimes pay a farmer monthly for an allotment of vegetables in most cases, but in other cases, a wider offering.
Okay. And now, I think Essex Farm is a little bit from your typical CSA farm. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, briefly, I think Kristin and I decided we wanted to have a farm that offered all the food we wanted to eat, and we figured that would also be something that our members would be interested in. So when we conceived of this business, we thought, why not expand CSA from vegetables into a full offering? And right now we offer vegetables, grains and beans, dairy, eggs, and meat. And I think the one place that we still are striving for is to offer more fruit. Our members get strawberries and raspberries, but I think they'd all really like to get apples, peaches, and pears. So that's one thing we really haven't developed very far.
That's amazing. So your members can basically get any of the food that they need in their daily diet.
Yeah, I think the difference maybe between what we're offering and a supermarket is selection. We don't have as many different items offered yet, although we'd like to in the future. And I think the other big difference between us and a supermarket would be that we don't do a lot of processing to the food, so members need to learn how to cook really quickly to figure out how to optimize the share for themselves.
Okay, that's great. So what have you been harvesting recently?
Well, the meat and the milk and the eggs and the grains are sort of ongoing. The grains, we've harvested wheat a month ago. And in terms of vegetables, we're just passing the summer's peak, so we're getting into fall vegetables like broccoli, cabbages, fall lettuce, and we're just finishing up on things like zucchini and cucumbers, tomatoes, and things like that.
Okay. Now, I mean, we've had a really hard year in terms of weather in this area of the world. I mean, there were really severe spring flooding, we had a really dry summer, and now we've had the effect of Tropical Storm Irene. Has that had any effect on your harvest at all?
Yeah, it has, in so many different ways. Probably the biggest agricultural shift this year was we were intending to grow 60 acres of field corn to feed our animals. And with the spring's moisture, we weren't able to get that planted. So that's both a financial and an agricultural setback for us. That said, after it dried up a little bit this spring, and as you know, it got really dry, our vegetables did really, really well until just recently.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me for a few minutes. Now, Mark and I will be back after Kristin does her first reading, so I'll just remind everybody, if you have any questions that you want to ask Mark or Kristin, to just put them on our Facebook page or on Twitter using hashtag #TheDirtyLife. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Kristin Kimball.
Hi, everybody. I thought I would do a reading from the first part of the book. This is the section where I meet Mark, this young farmer, for the first time. I was a city girl at this point, and this was my first time on his farm. The first time I laid eyes on Mark, we were in the run-down trailer that served as his farm office and his home. I had driven 6 hours from Manhattan to interview him for a story I was pitching about the young farmers who were growing the kind of local, organic food that more and more people wanted to eat. I knocked on his front door during what turned out to be the after-lunch nap. When nobody answered, I let myself into the kitchen and called out. And after a minute, the bedroom door banged open and Mark strode down the hallway, buckling his belt. He was very tall, and his long legs propelled him toward me with a sort of purposeful grace. He wore scuffed leather work boots, blue jeans gone white at the thigh, and a devastated white dress shirt. He had lively green eyes, a strong and perfect nose, a 2-day beard, and a mane of gold curls. His hands were large and calloused, his forearms corded with muscle and wide blue veins. He smiled, and he had beautiful teeth. I smelled warm skin, diesel, earth. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and then he was abruptly gone, off on some urgent farm business, the screen door banging shut behind him, promising over his shoulder to give me an interview when he got back that evening. Meantime, I could hoe the broccoli with his assistant, Kina. I recorded 2 impressions on my notebook later on. First, this is a man. All the men I knew were cerebral. This one lived in his body. Second, I can't believe I drove all this way to hoe broccoli for this dude. That first night, instead of doing an interview with him, I helped Mark slaughter a pig. I'd been a vegetarian for 13 years, and I was wearing a new white Agnes B blouse, but he was short-handed, and being on his farm without helping felt as unnatural as jumping into a lake and not swimming. I'd never seen an animal slaughtered before, and I could not look when he shot the pig, a sow named Butch with black and white spots, like a porcine character in a children's story. Once she was still, I regained my equilibrium. I helped hoist the carcass on a gambrel and make the eviscerating cut from breastbone to belly, holding the steaming cavity open while Mark cut the organs free from their moorings. I was not disgusted, but enlivened by what we were doing. I was fascinated by the hard white purse of the stomach, the neat coil of intestines, the lacy white caul fat, the still bright heart. I stayed at a chain hotel in town that night and soaked the pig grease off of me in a bathroom that seemed shockingly white and sterile. I felt like I'd been on a very long trip to a foreign country. The next morning, I got up at dawn and went back to the farm. Mark's crew was gathered for breakfast, cornmeal pancakes, and homemade sausage drizzled with warm maple syrup. I ate a double helping of the sausage, and that was the end of my life as a vegetarian. Mark disappeared again right after breakfast, the pig in the back of a borrowed Explorer, off to his Amish friend's butcher shop. He'd be back in the afternoon, he said, and we could conduct a proper interview then. In the meantime, I could rake rocks in the tomatoes with his other assistant, Michael. Michael did not look optimistic about my work capacity. I had traded my white blouse for a vintage Cheap Trick t-shirt, tight jeans, and a pair of thrift store dingoes with chunky little heels. It was the kind of ironic chic outfit that worked well in the East Village, but looked strange and slightly slutty in a field in Pennsylvania. I thought of myself as extremely fit, and, as I phrased it to myself, strong for my size, which was a slight 5'2", including the heels on the dingoes, even though my most vigorous exercise at that time came from regular games of pinball. I asked Michael a lot of questions to cover my puffing, and took every opportunity to lean on the rake in a pose of intense listening. The July sun stung like a slap on the face and raised up around us the sharp, resinous smell of tomato. The plants were as tall as I was and heavy with fruit, held upright by twine and oak stakes. To a person used to growing nothing bigger than herbs in a window box, they seemed vaguely menacing. The soil between the rows was dry and clumped and heavily studded with rocks. Michael told me to ignore the rocks smaller than an egg and rake the rest into piles, then shovel the piles into a wheelbarrow to be dumped in the hedgerow. I was shocked by the weight of each shovelful of rocks, and I flipped the wheelbarrow on my first trip. Rake, shovel, dump. 2 interminable hours passed in this way until it occurred to me that if this went on much longer, I'd seize up entirely and be unable to depress the clutch in order to drive myself home. In desperation, I offered to go in and cook lunch for everyone. I tried to make the offer sound casual. I couldn't quite believe how much damage I'd done to myself in so short a time. There were blisters rising between my left thumb and first finger. I couldn't fully straighten my back, and my crotch, imprisoned in the tight jeans, felt chafed beyond repair. I wasn't much of a cook back then. I appreciated good food, but I didn't have a steady relationship with it. Food was more like a series of one-night stands, set in front of me at a restaurant or delivered in little white cardboard containers by a guy on a bicycle. I wasn't sure the oven in my apartment was functional, since in the 7 years I'd lived there, I'd never used it. The refrigerator worked, but in my small studio, it was more valuable to me as storage space than as a kitchen appliance. I kept the dog's kibble in there, and a Brita pitcher of water, and, bookshelf space being dear, the Manhattan phone book, which in my memory of those years will always be heavy and cold. The freezer held a tray of shrunken ice cubes and a bottle of Polish vodka. Mark's kitchen took up half the trailer and reminded me of a market in a third world country. It was stuffed full of colorful and unpackaged things, the smells of milk and meat and dirt and vegetation mingling together in an earthy perfume that was strong but not unpleasant. I opened doors, peered cautiously at the high shelves. The cabinets held gallon jars of black beans and dried apples, wheat and rye berries, small dry ears of corn. The cupboard above the stove was full of bundled herbs and unlabeled bottles of some fizzy amber liquid. I opened the refrigerator and found an uncovered pot brimming with soft, bloody things that I recognized as Butch's internal organs, and a wire basket of scuffed brown eggs. In the crisper were ball jars of butter and cottage cheese, a pile of golf ball-looking things that may have been turnips, and some carrots, unwashed. I quickly shut the refrigerator door and grabbed a basket and a knife, and went back out to the field where Michael had finished raking rocks and was now busy mulching the rows of tomatoes with bales of half-rotted straw. I looked at the food that was there for the picking. New potatoes, broccoli, lettuce, herbs, peas, beets, and blackberries. There was a cow grazing with her calf, a flock of hens pecking away at some compost, another pig rooting through a pile of leaf litter. Everywhere I looked, there was plenty. I felt some ideas moving around in my head, big and slow, like tectonic plates. This was only a 6-acre plot, the size of a large playground, but there were vegetables here for 200 families. It all seemed so much simpler than I'd imagined. Dirt plus water plus sun plus sweat equaled food. No factories required, not a lot of machinery, no poisons or chemical fertilizers. How is it possible that this abundance had always existed and I had not known it? I felt, of all damn things, safe. Anything could happen in the world. Planes could crash into buildings, jobs could disappear, people could be thrown out of their apartments, oil could run dry, but here, at least, we would eat. I filled my basket with tomatoes and kale and onions and basil, calculating in my head the hefty sum that all those vegetables would have cost at the farmer's market in New York City, and went back inside, hoping to do them justice. I found 2 tools in the kitchen that are so familiar to me now, they're like old friends. A 10-inch soft steel chef's knife with a very sharp blade, and a cast iron skillet so big I could barely get my 2 arms around it. I set to work, cutting ribs out of the kale and chopping tomatoes and onions without knowing exactly where the meal was going. I did know that if the rest of the crew was as hungry as I was, I had better aim for quantity. I heated the skillet on 2 burners and sautéed onion in butter, adding some diced carrots and the tomatoes and a bit of water to steam the kale. I covered the skillet with something that looked like a manhole cover, and when the kale was soft, I dug shallow divots in it and cracked a dozen eggs into the holes to poach. Then I minced some garlic and basil together and mashed it into a knob of butter and spread that on slices of bread I'd found in the cupboard. I put the garlicky bread under the broiler, and just as the crew walked in from the field, I pulled the tray of fragrant toasts out of the oven with a flourish, dealt pieces onto plates, topped them with the kale and poached eggs, and crowned each with a spoonful of cottage cheese and a grind of black pepper. When we were all seated and served, I took my first trepidatious bite and then sat back. It was, I thought, astoundingly delicious. The kale, a fresh green backdrop to the hot, sharp bite of garlic and basil, and I felt very clever to have made it. I looked around the table, expecting raves and compliments, but there was only the flash of silverware, the purposeful movement of several jaws. "Please pass the salt," Michael said. It wasn't that my lunch was bad, I realize now. In fact, I bet they thought it was pretty good. But pretty good is just not that impressive to farmers who eat like princes every day. Food, a Frenchman once told me, is the first wealth. Grow it right, and you feel insanely rich, no matter what you own.
Thank you very much, Kristin. That was great. Now, I just want to remind everybody that if you have any questions, just to post it on our Facebook page or on Twitter using #TheDirtyLife. So we're just going to take a few minutes. Mark and I are going to chat a bit more, and then Kristin will read again. So we heard about her reminiscing meeting with you, Mark. Is that how you remember it?
Yeah, I think she told it really well. I think one of the things she may not have mentioned was that her hair was probably about this long at that point, so she looked very unique.
Okay, and what did you think?
I remember sometime early on when we met that she seemed pretty smart. And that sort of sticks in my mind, that she had questions for somebody who hadn't obviously spent a lot of time at farms that were a little more thought-provoking than I was expecting.
Okay, and so did that, impress you about a city girl?
I think I was impressed, but I don't think I had sort of romantic inclinations.
Even
at the first meeting.
Oh, okay. Okay, those came a little bit later. Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. Now, did anybody come up to Essex Farm from your farm in Pennsylvania where you first began?
We've been visited here, not as workers, but as friends now of people that worked with me in Pennsylvania. So both Keena and Michael, who worked with me there, have visited here now.
Okay, great. Now, and we know later on in the book that you eventually go and you visit Kristin in New York City. What was that like?
I think that sometimes Kristin thinks that I haven't had much exposure to cities, and I think comparatively that's true. I really like being in cities, but I think I don't act normal in cities. So her perspective maybe that I was out of place in cities I think may still hold, but I think that's more my being a little bit different. I look people in the eye. I ask them questions that I'm thinking about. And sometimes people offer me money because I look homeless. That's happened a couple of times. So I think...
Now, do you accept it? That's the question.
At one point I did accept some money. Yes. But I think that for Kristin was sort of the shock, that I wasn't hip. I go into the city and I just acted the way I was on the farm. Hey, how you doing? And I think that was a little uncomfortable at first for her, and then I think for both of us trying to figure out how to be cool around her friends and around people in general. Right. Taxi drivers, I'd be talking with them about eviscerating sheep, and Kristin would be like, "You don't talk to taxi drivers about eviscerating sheep." So.
No, I remember that in the book, that she commented that you seem to have more in common with the taxi drivers from foreign countries than you did with necessarily other people in the city. And that you could get, and I think she even said you were in a taxi and the driver actually turned off the meter and sat and talked with you.
Yeah, that sounds right.
That's a very unlike a New York taxi driver.
Well, I think that goes to the sense that I'm developing. And I wasn't raised on a farm. I was raised on a homestead, and I think there's a difference. But I think once anyone has farmed, it's sort of a special universal language on some level, even if it's a small vegetable plot or a 10,000-acre corn plot, that especially in a city setting, it's almost like finding somebody from your hometown that you can talk about, well, how were the spring rains, or how was your soil, and were there lots of rocks in it where you were from. So I think that common ground is what we often look for when we meet anybody. And so to find people from the developing world driving taxi in New York, talking about the land, seemed normal. I think to both parties, except I think Kristin was the one that was sort of a little bit aghast maybe at times.
Right, a little surprised by that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're starting to get some questions in, but I think we might just go back to Kristin to read her second passage, so then they're both here to answer all of your questions. So if you're good with that.
Sounds great.
Just one more reminder, if you have any questions, post them on our Facebook page or on Twitter using #TheDirtyLife. And now we'll go back to Kristin.
I thought I would read a section that comes a little bit later in the book. For those of you who have read the book, you know that this first year here on the farm was a huge learning experience, and this passage comes from a particularly steep part of that learning curve. I think what you need to know for this section is that our first team of working horses that we were using to do our field work on the farm were named Sam and Silver, and they were a pair of Belgian geldings. They weighed about 2,000 pounds each. And I think I also mentioned my old dog Nico in this passage, and she's the dog that came with me from New York City, long gone now. Mark had spent a few late nights in the machine shop that week, rebuilding the horse-drawn manure spreader that we'd bought to spread our compost. He and I filled it a quarter of the way full with shovels of our compost and took it to the field to test it out. It was a slick old machine. A wagon, basically with a narrow, high-sided wooden box. 2 chains ran along the bottom of the box toward a set of 3 beaters in the back. The chains and the beaters were geared to the wagon's wheels. When I engaged the gears and the horses moved forward, the chain moved and the beaters spun, and our compost was flung in a high, wide arc behind the moving wagon. Mark and I cheered. Then, halfway down the row, the beaters kicked a clod of compost forward instead of back. It sailed past my head and whacked Silver on the rump. Startled, he laid his ears back and moved faster. The chain and the beaters moved faster too and got louder. The horses, unnerved, tried to run, and it took all my strength to hold them back. After that, Silver seemed to distrust the spreader. When I engaged the gears, his neck tensed and his head shot up high. The horses and I could spread a ton of compost in the time it took to cross the long edge of our field, which was less than 3 minutes. The tedious part of the job was loading that ton of compost into the spreader. Mark helped me shovel it in with a pitchfork by hand, and each load took 20 minutes. As the day wore on, we got tired, and each load took longer still. By afternoon, the tractor, with its bucket loader, began to look very attractive. It could do the same work in 2 effortless scoops. The only problem was, Silver hated that tractor. When we passed it, parked in the barnyard, he eyed it as though it were a crouching wolf. I worried that the sound of it roaring behind him in his blind spot would be too much for him. But we were tired, and it was getting late. Mark fired up the tractor, promising to stop and turn it off if Silver got worked up. I got off my seat on the spreader and went to the horses' heads, because that's what I'd always done with riding horses, to give them confidence. I remember what happened next as though it were a movie. Wide shot of me at the horses' heads, holding one bridle in each hand, watching Silver's ears. Then a close-up on the blue bucket of the tractor brimming with compost. The soundtrack is a throbbing diesel engine. Cut to Silver dancing a little, but holding it together. Then the bucket dumping into the spreader, Silver going hollow-backed and stiff, the bucket clanging once against the metal side of the spreader, and Silver exploding. His weight on his haunches, his front end off the ground, his head 8 feet in the air, my hand no longer on his bridle. Then we see the back ends of 2 horses at a dead run, the spreader rocketing down the long driveway toward the road, the futile lines between the rolling wheels of the spreader as impossible to reach as the moon. I've had more than one opportunity to wonder since then what it feels like to be a horse running away. I know there is fear, but also I think there's a certain kind of joy. Or if not joy, then exhilaration, abandon. The broke horse is always poised between his instincts and his training, and running is giving in to the instinct, the powerful impulse to use his long legs for what they evolved for, to put distance between himself and his death. That's why a horse that has been through a runaway once cannot be fully trusted again. The option of escape has been opened. I don't remember making the choice to jump clear of Silver when he reared, only that suddenly I was clear, and the horses were running. The noise of the spreader clanging along the driveway was like gas on a fire. Instead of running from the sound of the tractor, the horses were running from the loud, inescapable thing hitched behind them. They ran with their necks stretched out, bits resting loose in their mouths, full gallop. Ridiculously, I ran after them. I remember stripping off my jacket and dropping it on the driveway, as though that could make me run faster. The distance between me and the horses was impossible within seconds, and it opened up wider and wider. By the time they reached the end of the driveway, they were 100 yards away from me. I tried to will them to stop before they reached the road. They did not stop. They turned. Now they were running parallel to the road, on the path at the edge of the field. I ran off the driveway and through a field, hoping against logic that I could cut them off, catch up, and what? Jump in front of them? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark moving like a bullet down the driveway. He'd leapt from the tractor and grabbed his bicycle, and he was tearing after the horses, leaning forward in racer position, legs like pistons, silent, fast. My brain was electric with adrenaline, shuffling the possibilities, which ranged from bad to worse. The field ran east along the road for half a mile before turning into woods. There was a ditch between the field and the road. Would the horses hit the woods and stop? Or would they run into the ditch and wreck? Or would they turn and keep running around the farm until they hung up on something or upended? The answer was none of the above. Near the end of the field, there was a covered culvert over a 10-foot section of the ditch. Neatly, as though they'd planned it, the pair slowed slightly, made the 90-degree turn over the culvert onto the road, and turned again, running east now on pavement, toward town. They'd crossed the yellow line, so at least they were running in the proper lane as they'd been trained, and not straight into oncoming traffic. I could hear them for longer than I could see them, the metal wheels of the spreader raising an enormous clatter. By the time I reached the road, they were gone, out of sight over a slight hill. And so was Mark, pumping furiously behind them, gaining. Nico was on the road too. Excuse me. Nico was on the road too, caught up in the excitement, running crookedly on her arthritic legs, trailing the whole parade. They were a half mile from town when I last saw them. If they made it all the way, the road would end in a T, and the worst-case scenarios would get worse still. I stood in the middle of the road and flagged down the first car that came by, driven by a middle-aged man with a beard. He was brave to stop for me, panting, hair on end, dabbed with manure. He let me into the passenger seat of his car. I tried to control my breathing, told him my horses had run away, and asked if he would please drive me slowly toward town. He asked how long it had been since they'd gotten loose, and I said I thought about 15 minutes, which was ridiculous in retrospect. It couldn't have been more than 3. He did not comment, and I did not offer any more details. I knew the end of the story was close, and I dreaded it. The traffic was light on that road, but fast. A collision was unthinkable, and Mark looked awfully vulnerable on the bicycle. I couldn't believe the horses could go at that pace much longer before one of them tripped and went down, and I couldn't force my brain to imagine what would happen after that. I do remember calculating how long it would take me to get back to the farmhouse for the gun, should one be needed. It was a very long mile I rode with that man. Just as we crested the small rise, I saw the horses coming toward us, in the proper lane, at a calm walk, bathed in golden, late afternoon light, like the saccharine closing shot of a Hollywood movie. Mark was on the seat of the spreader, lines in his hands, smiling, and Nico was trotting along behind, tongue lolling. Neither horse looked lame, and I did not see any blood. I rode home in the box of the spreader, and Mark told me his story. He had caught up with the horses and pulled ahead of them on his bicycle, slowed down slightly, and told them to whoa. They'd been running in the right lane, but when they saw him in front of them, they veered back to the to the left. Mark inched left, and they veered to the right. A car approached them from behind at that moment, saw what was happening, and unbelievably passed them on the far left. The car pulled ahead of the horses and tapped its brakes, and the horses slowed a little. Whoever was driving the car must have thought better of it then, because they sped off, leaving Mark and the galloping horses behind. Mark struggled to stay ahead and slightly to the left of the horses, and they drifted more and more to the right, until Sam, who was hitched on the right, was on the soft shoulder of the road. Mark saw with a sick feeling that they were approaching the beginning of a guardrail, a metal post strung with 3 strands of thick cable. In 2 strides, they were upon it, 1 horse on either side. In another stride, it would pass between the horses and hit the spreader, and at that speed, the spreader would flip, or worse, and both horses would be maimed or killed. That was what should have happened. What actually happened was that Sam ran on one side of the guardrail and Silver on the other, and they both went from a dead run to a full stop in 1 stride, and the spreader stopped a foot before the guardrail, and both horses stood still, blowing, until Mark got to their heads. He said that when he reached for their bridles, they did not look panicked as much as sheepish. He picked up the lines, took his seat, backed them away from the guardrail, then turned them around and began the walk home.
That you have they have a small dairy cattle herd, and she wants to know what would keep you motivated in the hard times, and what advice you guys would give to young farmers.
That's a great question. Can I take the first part? Mm-hmm. You can take the second part. I think what motivates us is that we're feeding people. Every Friday we have 170 people turn up at the farm, and they need to eat, and they've paid us hard-earned money for the year, and they're expecting enough food to carry them through the week. And there's something incredibly intimate about the relationship that you have with the people who are eating the food from your farm. We have children who were basically made of our food from the time that they were conceived until they're, born and running around and going to school. And when it gets hard, we think about those people that we're feeding and go back out and finish what we were doing. What's your advice to young farmers?
I think I'd add to that, too, that we also do it because we like to eat. And I think our first motivation, probably before we even had a business, was that we really like to cook and eat together.
Okay. Okay.
And the second part of the question was sort of what motivational advice for young farmers. I guess I'd say, and I think there's a lot of answers to that question, but after a while when people asked us why we were doing what we do, and there are challenges and tons of setbacks and the weather and a million different things go wrong, the only satisfying answer that I've come up with that I kind of hold to is that what motivates us is because it's difficult. And I think the trajectory of human development has been to make things easier, and I think it's gotten not too easy, but I think for me the excitement is often just the challenge itself to try to make it happen. And so my answer is the motivational thing is the hardness itself, sort of like getting married or having kids. Those are all challenging things, but I think they bring out the most of your humanity.
Okay, well, hopefully that helps you, Brianne. Now, this kind of follows up a bit with Kristin's answer. So Melissa had said she was kind of wondering if you'd had any storm damage in the recent storms, and then if so, how do you compensate your group if you cannot provide their farm goods? And she said just a little hello from Carlin Road, Rome, New York, that you'll know it.
Home girl.
But, do you have any issues, I guess, with providing members their diet when you have weather events like we recently have had?
You want me to take it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a lot of mythologies around farming in general, and I think membership farms have a similar mythology. And one of those mythologies is that people eat a lot more on a year when crops are bountiful and a lot less when crops aren't. And I think it's important as producers to realize that people eat pretty much the same amount. And so if you're providing a farm where people are paying money and depend on you, then I think it's our responsibility to make sure that there's enough food for them to eat. And so if we have a crop failure that's significant enough for our diet to be affected, then we often will work with another producer who uses similar techniques and actually buy in crops.
Okay.
So we'll both buy in vegetables, grass-fed meat if we don't have the right animals to slaughter, and grains.
Okay.
We also hedge against weather events like that by planting up to twice as much as we think we might need.
Oh, wow.
And that helps. One of our goals is to have all of our members eat like farmers. So we want them to be just surrounded by abundance as much as we possibly can. If we plant twice as much, sometimes we're surprised and have a lot of extra. But generally, I don't think we've ever had a year where we've worried that there wasn't enough to eat, even in a very difficult season like this year. And our troubles with the tropical storm Irene were nothing compared to what other farmers in our region faced. We had 30 chickens that drowned and we lost some topsoil, but otherwise our farm is totally fine. In fact, we had just put drainage in on some of our wetter fields, so we recovered from the storm pretty quickly. But I know a lot of our neighbors in the region and farmers that we know across the state and the region really had a much worse time of it and lost a lot of crops.
Right.
So we were very lucky.
That's good. That's good. I mean, this again kind of follows up. Andrea had asked on Facebook that that you'd mentioned due to the early rainy season that you'd had no opportunity to plant corn. So what do you feed the livestock then in place of corn?
That's a great question. And what we'll do in this case, we've done a couple things. We had a good wheat harvest last year, so we had some wheat left over.
Okay.
So we replaced some of our corn ration with wheat. And then we also bought in from other local organic farmers more wheat that they had grown. And then we're also going to probably end up buying in for next year corn that we would have harvested this fall.
Okay.
So we're going to feel the effects of it both financially and agriculturally, not this year because we're still feeding last year's corn,
right,
but probably sometime in October, November when our corn runs out from last year, if that makes sense.
Right. No, complete sense. Complete sense. Now, in your book, you had the birth of your first child. Now, when the book was published last year, you actually welcomed the birth of your second child. So this next question kind of says, how do you do it all? She says, Sarah says, I'm a 26-year-old beginning farmer. My husband and I have rented land and run a CSA for 2 seasons. What do you do in your lives or recommend to prevent farming burnout and balance family time with the daily work? And she says, your book re-inspired me during the hardest of times this season. Thank you.
Wow, I'm so glad. It's a great question because I don't think I do the juggling very well. And it's a constant struggle, I think, to find the right balance between farming time, family time, and the rest of life, whatever that might be. One of the things that we did really early on to try to prevent burnout, because as all farmers know, it's not bankruptcy that's going to kill your farm, it's burnout and divorce. So one of the things that we did early on was make sure that Sundays were our day. We have no visitors on the farm on Sunday. We do chores, but we try to do very little else. And we make sure that we do something as a couple or as a family to sort of get us ready for the coming week. But it's not easy. Certainly with 2 children, I am not the farmer I once was. You just can't pull those, 12 or 14-hour days in the field anymore because you have 2 little beings who are depending on you. And I think that'll get a little bit easier as they go older, but it's a hard juggle. It is a hard juggle.
So do you have several workers on the farm helping out, or how does that work?
We do.
Because I think at the first Adirondack Youth Climate Summit, you were trying to, entice some students to come and help you and labor on the farm. So, how does that work?
You want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that's one of the debates Kristin and I have often is sort of what's the ideal ratio of other farmers working here and how much do we want to do ourselves. Right now we have 8 full-time employees.
Oh, wow.
So we're able to be up at this time of night and not falling asleep. And that's been a huge help in terms of having our young family. But at the same time, as anyone who has employees knows, there's always people issues coming up. So that, and I think most people know what that's like, just having frictions that are because you're tired or anything like that. So there's new series of challenges that come up that aren't about how many bales can you lift in a day, but more how do you do the right diplomacy with the people you're working with, and that's also caused both stresses and successes. And on the good days, we're so glad that we have 10 farmers working with us, and when it's difficult, we sometimes look back to those first years and think, let's just do it ourselves. And that's, I think, again, that's a balance that's always evolving, and I think we're learning slowly how to become better employers, and that whole practice of becoming business people as well as farmers and family is, like you said, it's an ongoing challenge. And I think one of the things that we keep coming back to, and this maybe isn't the best way to run a business, but we keep coming back to the idea that the most important thing is that we and our family are healthy and happy. We're healthy and satisfied, however you want to say that. And although that's always a challenge, to remember that the farm really doesn't exist without the two of us at this point, and to remember that we do need to treat ourselves and our family with the respect we treat our employees and the farm is really important and still challenging, but we constantly look at that goal and what's the most important thing. It's like, all right, we need to take a day off, or we need to take a deep breath and sit back.
That's great. I think that's a great lesson for everybody, that, you just need to take some time off and relax and regroup. Now, Michelle has a question here, and I'm sure that many others joined her in asking it. She wants to know, Kristin, will there be a sequel?
I'm working on it.
You're such a talented writer.
I'm working on it. I have a couple ideas in mind, and I'm working on a sequel. Mark thinks I should call it The Dirty Wife. So, yes, there will be a sequel.
Good.
Yeah. But I don't know when, Michelle.
And I think that the sequel is contingent on Kristin finding the right space, both metaphorically and literally, to write in. And maybe this will be an indication of its future, but her first book she wrote in a 3-by-3-foot fluorescent lit fire department closet, literally, with no windows. And we now have some cabins on the farm that we've built in the past for employee housing. And just this past week, she ended up cleaning out one of those to create a writer's retreat. And I think I'm excited that you have a space to do that.
It's great, yeah.
Great.
It is great.
Now, that'll just be a writer's retreat for you. It's not like you're, inviting other writers. Or,
Ooh.
No. So what other sorts of events do you have going on here at the farm?
We have a tour coming up October 22nd. It's a Saturday. We're going to do a work session in the morning, followed by a picnic potluck lunch on the farm and a tour in the afternoon. And then there's an optional dinner in the town of Essex at the Essex Inn that evening. So there will be details about that posted on the Dirty Life Facebook page. October 22nd, it's a Saturday, $25 a person. All the money goes to our sliding scale, which funds our low-income members.
So about how many members do you have, and what is the cost to become a member?
We have 170 members right now. It costs $6,000 per adult couple for the year, and $100 for children per year of age. So a 5-year-old would be $500, a 6-year-old would be $600, etc. And that's all you can eat year-round.
Great. Now, somebody, when we were preparing for this, I was posting some things on Facebook, and somebody wrote this to us, and I just thought it was really amusing, and I just wanted to read it to you guys. This is from Debbie, and she said, "While driving home from picking up our son from summer camp in the Adirondacks, we read The Dirty Life out loud to one another. Changing readers when we change drivers. Our son was in charge of looking up and defining the new words we came across as we read. We laughed, felt joyous, were concerned, and had high hopes for Kristin and Mark as if they belonged to us. We learned about food, animals, farming, messy love, and added some great new words to our vocabulary. We got excited about farming. We wished we could visit our friends Kristin and Mark. It was such a wonderful read that we ran out of gas along the way because we were so absorbed in every word that we forgot to check the driving detail of fuel. As we sat waiting for the AAA service truck to bring us gasoline, we continued reading. Our only regret is that the book came to an end. Thank you, Kristin and Mark, for making our 9-hour trip home go very fast. We wish you very well."
Oh, that's so sweet.
So you caused people to run out of gas.
Sorry about that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for coming to visit.
I think your commitment to the farm and your family and all of your members is amazing, and we were so glad that we were able to come here tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And if you're interested in buying a signed copy of The Dirty Life, just visit wildcenter.org/dirtylife and click on Buy the Book Now. If you want to find out more about becoming a Wild Center member, visit our website, wildcenter.org, and click on Belong. We're interested in your comments about tonight's Barncast, so make sure you let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to suggest other topics or places you may like to see us broadcast from. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.